All right, but let's kick off by trying to delineate the subject. What is, the depth psychology in your? How do you define the term? And perhaps later we'll jump into the genesis of this area of activity, human activity. So, what is depth psychology?
I think depth psychology is the assumption that what's going on for human beings is not always immediately evident. So a more behavioral approach to psychology will assume that more or less by observing how a human person or a group reacts and behaves will tell you what you need to know about what's going on in the group, or at least lead you to what you need to know. Whereas depth psychology says, no, we're much more complicated than that, and we're not completely transparent to ourselves or to observers. And so it's devised ways of trying either to reveal more of those depths or to relate to those depths when they're still quite obscure.
Right. You also, we also hear the terms Cartesian psychology and non-Cartesian psychology. Could you, I mean, how do you treat these terms? What do you understand by the term Cartesian psychology? It seems to me that somehow the depth psychology is in more or less direct opposition to the notion of Cartesian psychology. Do you agree with that statement? Or
do you know, I've not actually, that I recall, quite heard the phrase Cartesian psychology, but the Cartesian element, if this is right, is often referred to, for example, the use of measurement. Cartesian coordinates applied to psychology, if you like. Is that the kind of thing you have in mind?
I think so. Yes, it's like I mean, yes. Well, that's a good. So you haven't heard that much the term Cartesian psychology. That's not the term that you use all that much. I understand.
I've never used it so far as I know. I mean, the Cartesian change in the 17th century clearly is a very broad thing, but not so directly applied to psychology.
Yeah. All right. Well, the way I understand is that's kind of the overlightened Cartesian consciousness, which is, I mean, in the extremis, it's just completely transparent to itself. That's the way I understand. But if you don't use that term, then we'll.
I mean, I could make. There's a comment which, if measurement is a key thing, I think that one of the troubles that modern psychology as a whole faces is that it's based on the assumption you can make measurements of the human psyche and human behavior. And so a very typical procedure in psychology is to set up a thesis, to create some kind of scenario that tests the thesis, often in a lab, and then measure whether you get the right percentages so that the thesis lasts. But the trouble with that is, manifold. That we human beings, for one thing, are very reflexive creatures, that immediately the conditions, even just knowing what's going on, makes a massive difference to us. So it's very, very hard to have all the controls that are necessary for that kind of post-Cartesian science. But I think also another problem is that in psychology, it's very hard to define terms and agree on defined terms. What is the self? What is the ego? What is the soul, if you think such a thing exists at all? And that's very different, from within physics, where, work, for example, a key concept in physics is very clearly defined. It's energy that does something. And so psychology both suffers from this very reflexive environment, but also from not having a clear ontology, really. That means that psychological experiments are very hard to replicate. For example, there's this enormous phenomenon now of what's called the replication crisis,
And not confined only to psychology, I understand.
Yeah, but it shows up, you know, it's I think it came up, it was spotted first in psychology, which I think is kind of significant. And the standard response to the replication crisis, which is this notion that this realization that a very significant proportion of the standard experiments in psychology can't be replicated. And it's something very substantial. You'd have to check this, but it's like 70% or more. And I think that the standard response is do more experiments, but I think that will just prolong the replication crisis, because you've got to ask, you know, what's actually being tested here? Can it be tested even in these very, you know, in these ways that people hope are very robust?
Well, the limited understanding I have it is that the key of the scientific method is to remove the subjectivity from the picture. But in psychology, I mean, if you remove the subjectivity, what else have you left, basically?
Yeah, no, that's a very neat way of putting it. Yeah, this idea that the truth of things is known from the outside in, as if you yourself have got nothing to do with the looking.
Yeah.
Which is so paradoxical, because of course physics has realized for a long time that the looking itself makes a difference, but it's almost as if the rest of the science hasn't caught up. It has this ideal of what physics is and hopes to replicate what physics is, when physics itself doesn't even have it.
Right. Yeah, this is the physics envy is the term that I mean, I was brought up as the economist. Fortunately, I have disentangled myself from my education by now, more or less. I have lapses back, but yeah, the physics envy was quite the term that was used in economics quite a lot, and I understand it's also in psychology.
Yeah, no, very much. Yeah, no, the idea that you can have sort of universal laws that apply to populations of human beings or even individuals is sort of strange, really, when you start to think about it. But yeah,
all right. One piece that I picked up, I can't remember exactly what conversation it was in one of your conversations with Rupert, and I also got a clip from there where you started to talk about Immanuel Kant and the profound impact that his revolution has had, and I think it still continues to have on the modern philosophy. So this one question I'd like to ask, one area I'd like to touch is, what is the significance of Immanuel Kant upon the development of depth psychology? I think that seems to me to be one of the watersheds in the development, because of its influence on Jung and so forth. But
yeah, well, I think I can't remember the exact comment that you mentioned there, but if I make a remark, then see whether it connects. I mean, one of the things which Kant is remembered for saying is that you can't know the thing in itself. So we human beings have glasses that filter reality, but also shape reality so that we can comprehend it. And as it were, if you try and take the glasses off, you can't make sense of anything. So things like the nature of time, the nature of space, Kant proposed that these are part of our mentality that we inherit, and we interpret reality through these notions of, for example, time and space. And so this creates, if you go with that, this creates a sense of alienation from reality in itself, because it can never be known directly. But I think that, well, immediately after Kant, you get the Romantic movement, which reacts against this and says that might be true for reason, but it's not true for aesthetics in particular. The notion of beauty and love and so on connects us. And I think that psychotherapy, depth psychology, is an inheritor of this Romantic sense. But it's post-Kantian too, so it recognizes that it's often hard to say in precise rational terms about our relationship to reality. But there's plenty of other ways of talking about it that people like Carl Jung were onto. So the obvious example there would be myth, and how ancient myth carry such profound resonance for us because they convey reality directly to us. And then people create personal myths, personal stories as well, that they develop through the great moments, the great resonances, the great desires of their lives. Yeah, so maybe that is something about this post-Kantian relationship in depth psychology.
So just to summarize, you're saying that romantic movement was a reaction to Kant in certain respects, and depth psychology grew out of the romantic movement.
I think so. Yeah, yeah.
Did I summarize it correctly?
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, Jung's interest in medieval thought, for example, is an example of that. And Freud, you know, remember Freud actually was as much celebrated for his literature as he was for his psychology in his own time. And, you know, that's very significant that he was a tremendous writer.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to depth psychology, where would you draw the, when does the term actually show up? Is it with Freud or?
Yeah, you know, I'm not sure about that actually. I mean, certainly I feel it's definitely used in relation to Jung, but partly because to distinguish it from psychoanalysis, you know, because Jung and Freud split in 1919. 1919. Jung himself talked about analytical psychology, which isn't a wholly helpful phrase in English, at least, because it suggests something far more rational than what Jung was driving at. But so maybe depth, I don't know, you'd have to check, but I wouldn't be surprised if depth psychology comes in as a way of describing the more Jungian inflection on psychotherapy.
How would you, let's, I'd like to ask you to compare Jung's, Freud and Jung vis-a-vis the depth psychology and also the split. Was it 1919? You mentioned the split between.
Yeah, yeah. So they, yeah.
Please elaborate on this split and its relevance on the formation of the depth formation and later development of depth psychology.
Yeah, well, one of the, it's a complicated story.
Oh yes.
But one of the differences that they had was that Freud was very much inclined to think that what we call the unconscious is our personal dislikes, traumas, proclivities, secret desires that are unacceptable socially. The personal unconscious is the unconscious for Freud, and so it's what's repressed and what's you know, disliked and so on that makes up our unconscious life, and then shows up in maybe strange, maybe neurotic, you know, maybe psychotic ways. And Jung thought that there was that element, there could be that element, but also we inherit contents of our minds, much as we inherit the shape of our bodies. He was very profoundly influenced by Darwin and evolution. And so he thought, you know, Jung was, yes. And so he thought that, you know, much as the shape of our hands comes just as much from the evolutionary history of humanity as a whole, as much as the gestation of our bodies in our mother's wombs, so too the mind must be the same. It's partly the immediate conditions of our lives that fill up our minds, but also we inherit. And that, you know, that's a Kantian idea, the idea too that we inherit perceptions of space and time and so on, you know, that those kind of features of our mental life, we don't create them ourselves. We're educated into them, but they're shared by all human beings, certainly all modern human beings anyway. It might be different in ancient times, and I think it probably was different in ancient times. Yeah, so this idea, and so this is Jung's idea of the collective unconscious, as well as the personal unconscious. And, you know, that then, although Jung repeatedly, particularly in his earlier life, after Freud, says that he's an empirical psychologist, he's just going on what he observes, the collective sense leaves him open to more spiritual, straight religious interpretations of psychology, because if the whole environment into which you're born is affecting you from the inside, then, you know, that creates the possibility that gods, for example, aren't just projections. Freud would say that gods are just projections from our personal unconscious onto the world around, whereas Jung would say no, that they have an autonomy, they exist in their own right, and we relate to them. And so that's part of the collective unconscious as well. So it makes for you know, a very different perception of what it is to be human. And Freud would say that the task of psychotherapy, for example, is just to make you a bit less unhappy with your lot. Whereas Jung would say that no, psychotherapy can be pursuing a whole lot more besides than just your own happiness, for example.
But how would you relate depth psychology with transpersonal psychology? Is one a subset of the another? Are they the same level of abstraction? How would, please shed a light on this question a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, transpersonal psychology is essentially saying that there's more going on than just your own private, autonomous, conscious and unconscious life. And that might be carried down through generations. It might be in relation to spiritual vitalities around and about. It might be, you know, more mundane cultural influences and so on. You know, the times and places have a spirit, the zeitgeist, and that affects us as well. So it's in many different ways. It's basically trying to be open to influence more. But I think it would also, transpersonal psychology and depth psychology would feel a pull from the future as well as the presence of the past.
The Aristotelian element comes into the picture then there.
Yeah, so there's more of a telos. So, you know, the psyche wants to expand and grow for the transpersonal or Jungian. And so the psychotherapist in those traditions is listening out for that as much as what might be holding people back from because of the past.
Mm-hmm. What was Freud's and I don't know him all that well. What was Freud's relationship to the notion of soul? Did he acknowledge it, or was it like in a vein of scientific rationalism where there is no such notion at all?
Yeah, it's a very complicated area actually, because the German for soul, apparently, which of course is what Freud used, carries far less spiritual or religious resonance than it often does, certainly in English. I mean, it might be different in other languages again, which you'll know better than me. So often what is soul in German, I think it's Seele in German.
Seele,
yeah, and gets translated perhaps as something like self or something like that, which sounds much more private. So I think that Freud actually is much more in a kind of romantic tradition that would understand and be alert to the soulful aspect of life, even without reference to gods, of course, or God. just the fact that we live in a felt, vital, dynamic awareness of things. I think, you know, Freud would be very alert to that in a way that sometimes gets lost in translation.
Mm-hmm. I mean, once we get into the depth psychology, it's hard to avoid the notion of an archetype. And what do you mean by archetype, and what's the, please elaborate on that one a little bit.
Well, it's again, always with Jung, he's one of these thinkers that's constantly developing, so you must always bear that in mind. But broadly speaking, archetypes are the inherited patterns of perception, awareness, maybe even showing up in behavior. So I think I'm right in saying that he would say that the reason why a bird knows how to build a nest, even when it hasn't been taught by its parents to do so, is a reflection of the archetype for nest building, you know, in the bird. But for human beings, we have these patterns of our inner life as much as our behavior. And so they exist inside us too. But because they exist inside us, they're not just kind of dead, inert patterns, but they're alive as well. They have the qualities of a personality, and so can become very active in our lives as well. You know, so probably the most famous archetype is the notion of the shadow. Mm-hmm. And this is a reflection of the fact that we often don't want to look at things that disturb us, but that doesn't mean they go away. Freud would say they fall into the shadow, which just means that we can't see them very clearly. But also, like a shadow, they're constantly following us around. And at times the shadow will make its presence felt, perhaps very profoundly, perhaps even disastrously on occasion. And so one of the tasks of therapy is to become more familiar what's in the shadow and sort of welcome it back, because it probably has something for you, in fact.
Mm-hmm. Well, I recently discovered myself James Hillman. How familiar are you with his work?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit. I know that some people say that he was probably the most important Jungian analyst since Jung, and of course he creates his own flavor of psychotherapy, depth psychology, archetypal psychology, you know, my engagement with him is not systematic, but you know, he's a very interesting thinker, and so the times that I've read him, it's very provocative. I think that this is very typical of modern psychotherapy, though, that there's very few people, I think, who are just in one school. Rather, most psychotherapists that I know in practice, they may read quite broadly and across a number of different schools. And what they're interested in, certainly what I'm interested in, is much more, is there an illumination that helps me just make the next step? And then, you know, it may be that the next step after that requires a different illumination from a different school. And so it's much more like having a whole range now of maps, and you might, you know, look at one very detailed map that's great at capturing one kind of inner landscape, but then need a different map to make the next bit of the journey. You know, there are disputes in psychotherapy. I don't want to deny that at all, but I think that most people now are quite eclectic, actually. And, you know, very typically you'll do a training in one school, but the reason why you do that is just to make sure you've got established well in, you know, a particular place, and so have sort of touched the depths of at least one school. And then that gives you the ability then to see the depths in other schools.
What is an archetype from I understand that they haven't looked into that deeply into Hillman, but what's your understanding of the archetypal psychology? What was he after there, really?
I wouldn't actually know precisely. I'm not you know, I've not read Hillman in that way.
Okay.
I mean, I think part of it was that he was relating to American appropriation of psychotherapy, which is a bit different from in Europe. And so essentially what happens is that when psychotherapy goes to the US, it's sometimes called self-psychology there. And it's broadly the idea, there's much more focus on building, say, a resilient ego in order to negotiate the world. And, you know, there's something clearly in that, because the ego, the sense of I-ness, needs to be able to hold us together. But I think that creates different expectations of what psychotherapy is about. So, for example, psychotherapy would be about becoming much more adaptable to the world, whereas in Europe, psychotherapy might well suggest things that are wrong with the world rather than just wanting to adapt to it. Now, you know, Hillman could certainly criticize the world. I know that much about him, the way things are. But I think that, yeah, I'm not quite sure what else I can say actually very clearly, because I'm not clear myself. But there's differences of culture that make a big difference, I think, as well.
There is a very memorable ship metaphor that he uses, that in psychotherapy, it's like there's a lot of crying that goes on in this little cabin below the waterline, and dialogues and as I said, a lot of crying in these little rooms, whereas the ship as a whole moves into the uncharted waters, and could well be Titanic, I guess. I think that's how I got sort of a telling metaphor, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
But please tell us now about your personal path into the. I understand that you studied physics at the bachelor or undergrad level. Please, how did you get involved in these ideas in the first place? Because that must have also been a bit of a transition from.
Yeah, I mean, there is a common theme, I think, that I've always been interested in the big questions of life. And so physics, philosophy, and psychotherapy have a practical side, but they are never that far from the biggest questions of what it is to be alive, what the nature of the cosmos is, and so on. So I've always been interested in that. But I think I originally did physics because I wasn't quite sure what else to do. I was very lost, really, as a younger person in my early adult life. And tried a number of things, and the physics was one of them. You know, I was also a clergyman. I got ordained and was a clergyman, and that didn't work out either. And it was only when I did the philosophy, which opened up Plato to me, and then realized that ancient philosophy is much more like modern psychotherapy, and it's like modern philosophy, because in the ancient world and the medieval world, it was assumed that you can really only know things if you are able to resonate with things. And so that means developing yourself as a person, you know, whereas the modern ideal, as we've said already in relation to Descartes, is just the objective observer that isn't in contact at all with what they're observing.
Oh, that would be a kind of participatory way of knowing, right?
Yeah. So a big word there would be participation, a good Owen Barfieldian word.
Yeah, well, you're not the last book, but the what's the English word for that? The one
penultimate
book.
Yeah.
Penultimate book was The Secret History of Christianity, and now you mentioned and it's also available in Estonian, and you mentioned Owen Barfield there. Please tell our readers what was this book about before we start to talk about your latest book.
So the Barfield book arose because Barfield was a revelation to me. Reading Owen Barfield was a revelation to me, and in a way kind of came to my rescue, because, for example, when I did this PhD on Plato and I got the PhD, but I felt I hadn't begun to understand really what Plato was driving at. And Barfield makes a remark in one of his books about how, in order to read ancient texts, we first of all have to unthink everything we think we know about not just the authors, but the words they're using. And it was that sort of was like a light bulb moment for me, because I realized that, for example, you know, when a modern philosopher uses the word like theory that can be objectively tested, whereas when a proposal that can be objectively tested.
Now I had problem with my connection. Could you please, you know, just repeat like I don't know, the last minute? Sorry, otherwise it's no use of it. I had problem with the connection. Could you just rewind it a little bit? Sorry about that.
Yeah. So Barfield makes this remark that when you read someone like Plato from the ancient or medieval world, the first thing you have to do is unthink everything you think you know about not just the person themselves, but the words they're using. And so an example of that would be a word like theory, very big word in Plato, but the modern sense of theory is a proposition that you then put to the empirical test. Whereas for Plato, theory is much more to do with an act of contemplation, where you open yourself to what you're observing, what you're engaging and relating to. And it even has older echoes of a journey that you make towards a horizon, and over the horizon a whole new world opens up to you. So it's a much more personally active notion, not just something that you can test by kind of pure logic or reason. And so this was really helpful to me when I read this in Barfield. And then I realized that, you know, he's very interested in the story of Christianity and the significance of Christianity. And I hadn't settled in my own mind what the significance of Christianity really is. But he has this account of Christianity that I found very helpful. And so my book, in a way, was to tell that Barfieldian account of Christianity, but also put it to the test a bit, because there's a lot of biblical scholarship now, for example, that I think illuminates and expands on what Barfield was saying. So I wanted to really make the case for this understanding of Christianity, and hence writing the book.
So the way I understand it, and please correct me if I'm and what I think of it, is that we have no problem. We have no problem with the idea that our knowledge has changed over time, but we have kind of much more. We don't realize that the whole modes of perceiving things have changed, and the way you and how the way how the meanings of the words have changed are kind of reflective of this bigger shifts of consciousness that have occurred over time. Is that more or less, is it fair to summarize your words up in that way?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely precisely right. Again, it's another strange bit of physics envy, that an assumption in physics has been what's called the principle of uniformitarianism, which is the idea that wherever you look across space and time, the laws of physics are the same, they don't change. Now, physicists will immediately qualify that now, because, for example, in black holes, they know that the laws of physics, that the laws of space and time are different. So even physicists now question the principle of uniformitarianism. But other sciences have adopted the same principle. And in psychology, that means assuming that the laws of human consciousness are the same across all periods of time and space. Whereas someone like Barfield is saying, no, that's precisely wrong. that consciousness is itself, as you say, the modes of perception are constantly evolving and changing too. And he got onto this because of the way that language does change, that even the same words can carry very different meanings and connotations across time. And he realized that words are what he called fossils of consciousness.
That was
they carry the meaning of an older sense. And this is why poetry is so rich and so on as well. It explains a lot about language.
Is that the phrase that Barfield uses, the fossils of consciousness? Yes, the word.
Yeah,
word.
yeah.
That's very memorable. That's a very memorable phrase.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's move now to your last book, and I'd like to move into that via the concept of purgatory. That was, I think in my I have my own fair bit of troubles, and I think one of the sentences that I picked up from Peterson, and actually I got to know you and Rupert via this conversation, Jordan Peterson effect, which was, just really opened up a new perspective of things. And you discussed about purgatory there. Could you please just elaborate on what you know? Yes, the sentence that Peterson uses, that the purgatory is a real psychogeographic region. That really was, wow, this kind of, the sentences which like struck occasionally. Please elaborate a little bit on the concept of purgatory. That would allows us to segue into Dante then. Yeah.
Well, I feel I've known purgatory in this life, let alone whatever happens next. Because I'm a psychotherapist, and that mean I went through my own psychotherapy, and there was definitely a period of descent into hell where the things that made me feel anxious in particular really came up in front of me, and I became very anxious for a period of time as a result. And purgatory was the next phase, if you like, after that, where rather than wanting to escape the anxiety, I gradually felt more able, with support, to lean into the anxiety and start to see what it was about much more. And purgatory, certainly in Dante's understanding, is the place in space and time, I think. So hence the idea of psychogeography, where we are able to do that, and where, for example, our vices can become virtues, where our fears can become desires, where the edges of our experience start to open up to be the horizons for new experiences and perceptions. Yeah, so I think that's absolutely right. That the notion of purgatory understood in that way makes a lot of sense. I mean, maybe a more colloquial understanding, purgatory means the place where you're purified, where the bad gets kind of burnt off. That's though not Dante's understanding. It's not a very rich understanding. It's like Purgatory 101, because actually, if you're a monotheist, everything is already within God, even what looks bad and evil, because if it wasn't in God, it would fall out of existence altogether. And I think Jung, in a particular way, understood this. So the question is how that which you think is bad and evil, its appearance changes so that you realize it's actually part of the good God. And so I think that's what purgatory is about much more in a theological way.
You finished, when did the book come out?
The Barfield book?
No, the Dante book now.
Oh, so the Dante book just came out last month, it's in September, so a couple of months back now, yeah. Because in September was the 700th anniversary of Dante's death.
Okay,
yeah. So he died in 1321.
Well, that probably is one reason, but that I guess not the only one. Why did you write the book on Dante in 2000? what it is, 21?
Yeah, so well, the year before, just before COVID started, I wanted to do a series of podcasts on the Divine Comedy, basically one podcast for each canto, and as a way of reading it again. I mean, I've read it a few times now, and I wanted to read it again, but the discipline of putting out a podcast means you have to really work out what you think's going on and so on, and portray that. So I started doing this podcast on each, a podcast for each canto. And then COVID hit, and so we were in lockdown. So it really became part of my lockdown discipline and really helped me through lockdown, just the pleasure of engaging with this text richly again, when a lot of the things weren't happening. And then someone said, actually, Rupert Sheldrake's assistant, who's called Pam, she said, surely this is a book. And then, so yeah, so the book came out of that. So there's 100 chapters, one for each canto, short chapters that both retell what happens and try to explain what happens, what's going on. So it can be read on its own. That's part of the idea. It can be read on its own, but as an introduction then to the text itself, because you know the Divine Comedy is a work of genius, and it keeps giving. It's one of these texts that just never stops giving to you, but you have to find a way into it to start with, and that's not straightforward. You know, Dante has guides. I think we need guides to get into Dante, and so hopefully this book can at least be a way of opening the doors into the Divine Comedy for people.
What would be the couple of recommendations for a person who would like to get? I mean, what would be the keys to Dante? What would you recommend after having finished that book now?
Well, it is actually get a guide, you know, but an introduction. But make sure you get an introduction that's going to address the questions you want to ask of Dante, because there's a lot of guides that, for example, do the history, that do the literature. That side of things, that do the personal life story of Dante in a biographical sense. But what Dante actually asks us to do, and this is what I've tried to do in my book, is to track what's happening to him as he journeys through these different realms and see how he changes, how he's transformed. And he conveys that with all the literature, all the allusions, the myths, the way that he layers the story in the Divine Comedy itself. So you know, if you're interested in the spiritual transformation, that's what I've tried to write about, because it's actually quite hard to find a book that addresses Dante in that way.
Well, this, did you say, when was the 700 anniversary of Dante's death?
It was the 14th of September last year, this year, 14th of September 2021.
We have 200 years of from the birth of Dostoevsky next week.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, well, we're going to have something on the front cover from him actually. So that's what's your relationship to him? Just because we have something from him on the front cover.
Yeah,
Dostoevsky, please.
Yeah, I've read some Dostoevsky, like the brothers Karamazov, but I don't really know it in any great depth actually, apart from to say something obvious. I mean, I think, you know, the encounter between Christ and the Grand Inquisitor, the famous moment where Christ kisses the Grand Inquisitor, you know, is a moment of huge significance. Largely because I think it's a very powerful comment on the modern church. You know, the modern church in many respects is the Antichrist, by which I don't mean that it's demonic or anything, but it's just so changed the gospel, particularly into you know, a call for social justice, say, that has actually lost the transformative heart of the gospel. Now, social justice is not a bad thing, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but it's the gospel is about something else, I think.
So you say, I don't want to use that. So you're saying that's has already certain other connotations, but would it be fair to summarize your argument that the modern church overemphasizes social part at the expense of the spiritual? Can I rephrase that? The words?
Yeah, no, that's a fair first sort of remark. I think that, and in particular, I think that there's very little sense in the church of going on the kind of transformative journey that someone like Dante goes on. You know, there's a lot of pastoral concern in the modern church, but the pastoral concern really is interested in consoling people. And so it's much more likely to say, you know, don't worry, God is love, you know, which is true in a way. But I think that love is a fierce love too. And it wants you to change so that you can know God with all that you might be, not just all that you are currently. And that, you know, that is, I'd even say it's inevitably a painful process. You know, it's there in the gospel. Good Friday comes before Easter Sunday. Take up your cross. I've come to divide, Jesus said. So, you know, that unsettling side of the gospel is absolutely there. But unless you have embarked on that yourself, and so trust the process, it's very hard to talk about it, I think. And I think that a lot of clergy and priests don't go on that journey. You know, that's a bold thing for me to say, and it's just my impression, of course. But I say it partly in contradistinction to psychotherapy, where, you know, the whole point of becoming a psychotherapist is that you've gone on that journey in some measure.
Right. That was a very interesting. I'd like to elaborate on that one, given our current social and political circumstances. The quote from Bible that you just used, that I've come, where the Christ says that I've come to divide. Please, how do you interpret these words in our current rather dire circumstances, I'd say?
I mean, I suppose my first interpretation is more psychologically, that if our political and social life is actually a sort of reflection of our inner lives, then the divisions which we see in public life are going to be reflections of divisions which are within ourselves. And I think, therefore, what Jesus means is that it's going to be by paying attention to those divisions within ourselves that the possibility of change comes. It's not about trying to cover up those divisions or sort of bypass them, because then no real reconciliation, no new perception of things can really emerge. It's just, you know, the same, but, you know, in kind of a wrapping that makes it a bit more acceptable. So I think, you know, Jesus is saying that if you really want to follow me, you should expect things to feel like they're falling apart, at least in periods. And, you know, this is a common perception in all mystical traditions. The Sufis will talk about bewilderment. Christians will talk about the dark night of the soul. Buddhists will talk about the terrors of meditation. You know, so this seems to me to be a universal truth. Right.
Yeah. Coming back to Hillman again, I mean, I'm reading his Revisioning Psychology now, and there's one sentence that, I mean, there are many sentences that intrigue and puzzle and confound me, but given the unique opportunity that you're there at the other end, I'd like to comment you on that sentence. I quote, our true religion is the monotheism of consciousness, a possession by it, coupled with a fanatical denial of fragmentary autonomous systems. What? I mean, I have obviously a vague understanding what he's after, but it would be just very interesting to see, to hear you to relate to that sentence.
Yeah, so I think that one way of responding to that is with some more Dante, because in the Paradise, Dante is very struck that the unity of the divine is expressed to him in the diversity of all the souls and angels and so on that he meets. But it's when they, in their diversity, become more and more fully themselves, that at the same time, they more and more fully express the one God too. So with, you might say, spiritual perception, monotheism is not a singularity. It's a unity of diversity. And that's why it's rich and why it's dancing and why it's creative and why it's light. You know, a nice Sufi image of this is that the diversity is like as many fragments of a mirror reflecting the light. But although each fragment will reflect the light in its different way, in its own way, it's still the one light that's getting reflected. Now, I think, again, you might be able to correct me on this, but I think that Hillman was a bit more directly anti-monotheism.
Oh yes, very much so.
Yeah, so he felt that polytheism captures the nature of reality more. I disagree with that, but because I think that you can understand the richness of the diversity as many expressions of the one reality.
It's just approaching the end of our conversation, that's which is a pity from my perspective.
Well, I tell you what, I mean, one thing we could do is I could go make myself a quick cup of coffee and we could talk more if you want, because I haven't got anything else on yet.
Oh yeah, that would be great. So. Yeah, I'll grab a coffee myself, and I'd like to just a little piece on perhaps Greek mythology, because
okay, no, I mean, when I said the time, I thought that perhaps it was going to be recorded or something for, you know, as a podcast, but it's not. So let's have a 5-minute break, make some coffee and come back.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, okay. Hey there.
Yeah, well, again, I mean, just cannot repeat how grateful I am for finding the time.
Well, thank you for it's wonderful to talk about these things. Thanks. I'm so glad you're interested and you feel the passion too. It's really nice.
Yeah, I am. And as I said, it's not an academic interest. It's just a personal, I mean, life is at stake, and pretty much, I think, has been at the stake. So that's where I've been. It's, I'm glad to say I'm not an academic. Right. You mentioned just, and I don't want to abuse your time anymore, and I really have to, but just 10-15 minutes would be great if you could spare. You mentioned Plato as a kind of breakthrough. Maybe but I had the impression that you mentioned Plato as a breakthrough in your own spiritual development. Could you just again shed more light on that, yeah, please, Plato and your
well, so Blake is another figure who understood.
I said Plato, the Greek. Did you hear Blake?
Plato? Oh, sorry, I thought it said Blake.
Blake is also interesting.
Oh, right, okay. No, I've mentioned Plato before. So I think Plato is at the cusp of the shift from the very ancient perception of things into, well, first of all, the kind of medieval, but then also he's still very relevant to us now in the modern period. And in particular, Plato, I think, understood that henceforth our engagement with the world was going to have to take the inner life of the individual much, much more seriously. So I think that in times before Plato, relationship to the gods was a much more collective and shared endeavor. It might be focused on symbolic figures like a king or a pharaoh, but it was still an engagement that a society as a whole would undergo. And that began to break down, I think, in the century or so before Plato. for various reasons. I mean, I think one is the way that writing started to be used, not just to make records in sort of financial transactions and so on, which was how writing originated, but to record the myths and stories. And the reason why that makes a difference is that you then read them on your own. And so it creates a sense of personal engagement with what's going on, rather than having them, say, rehearsed as part of an oral tradition at particular times and places, festivities, and so on. So anyway, the sense of the individual starts to emerge as we would relate to it. And this causes a shift of consciousness that means that the old ways of relating to the gods and life need to change. And so Plato is onto that. And I think probably what happened, although this is disputed in the scholarship, but probably what happened is that Plato met Socrates when he was quite young, when he was in his 20s, and then Socrates dies quite soon after Plato met him. But Plato realized that Socrates had sort of stirred something in him that he couldn't let go. And so he travels, I think, a bit for a while after Socrates' death. I think he went probably to Egypt, tried the old mystery religions in Egypt and realized they weren't really producing the transformation that maybe they had before. I think he perhaps even traveled around the Black Sea, because on occasions he talks about shamans in the Black Sea region. And again, the sense that they don't quite produce the transformation that they once had. And so what we call philosophy was his remaking of a tradition that could produce the kind of transformation that would enable us to see what he called the good, the beautiful, and the true. And it's about the cultivation of, say, our erotic desires, and seeing how they can guide us into richer and richer perception of reality. That's a key dynamic in Plato's philosophy. So, you know, this was tremendously exciting to realize, partly because I hadn't really thought about that very much at all when I was doing my PhD, because it's not the kind of thing that gets talked about in philosophy departments. Ripper puts all his dialogues in and take away the myths, and then just go for the kind of logical argument element, of which, you know, there can be quite a lot. But I think Plato always understood reason as in the service of sight and seeing more, rather than reason proving a kind of proposal about the way reality is.
I have a great books course at the school where I teach, and we'll next term we're going to take up Odyssey. What's recollections, anything that comes off the cuff what's your first reaction to Odyssey when you?
Yeah, well, the person who I would recommend reading on this actually is Jeremy Nadler, who we mentioned. So he has a book called In the Shadow of the Machine, and Odysseus is a key figure for him, because he thinks what's happening in the Odyssey, which becomes very popular in the middle of the first millennium BC. So it's around the same time that Plato's onto these changes. And Jeremy argues that Odysseus, who's the cunning man, you know, that's one of his main attributes. He's known as the cunning, devious, clever individual, is a figure of the human person learning to navigate the natural world, the divine worlds, through the use of their own cunning and their own creativity. But, you know, for good and ill, because on the one hand, it creates a new way of being in the world. But if you rely more on your own cunning and creativity than, say, communion with the gods, then you get cut off from that communion with the gods. And so a key story in the Odyssey is the encounter with the Cyclops, whose name, what's his name? I forget his name, that's terrible. I'm going to look it up because I can.
There's a Jeremy Nadler.
Yeah, Jeremy Nadler's book, In the Shadow of the...
In the Shadow of the
Polyphemus, that's right, Polyphemus, yeah, that's the giant sock. And so Jeremy interprets it as an encounter between a kind of an older consciousness, which is represented by Polyphemus, who is, you know, much closer to nature than Odysseus, and Odysseus, who represents the emerging consciousness. And, you know, Polyphemus is suspicious of Odysseus, but Odysseus tricks Polyphemus, and so can plunge the olive rod into Polyphemus's eye and so make his escape. And he's said that he's given himself a different name, you know, which means no one. And so when Polyphemus shouts out, "No one is here, no one is here," everyone else ignores him. So, you know, Odysseus, through his trickery, gives himself a false name, which helps him escape. But nonetheless, he then has to wander for years and years around the Mediterranean. So he's lost in the world, really. It's an image of him being lost in the world. So it's really, so the Odyssey is the beginnings of a transitional text, unlike the Iliad, you know, which is much more, I think, rooted in an older world. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we're approaching the grande finale. Conversation. It's now to it's time to build it up. There's one sentence that I heard actually 2 years ago from Stan Groff, and the sentence, it's a short sentence that he said that we are on the verge of the radical redefinition of reality, and that which I think, I mean, would be more fruitful to ask from himself, but I can't do it now. I can't do it, so I ask it from you. Is that it seems my gut feeling is that he's is referring to this fundamental shift in consciousness that we've been talking about to a large extent today. What I mean, given your experience and in psychoanalysis and what you've read and what you've written, what do you think he's after there?
So can you just say the expression again, because I didn't quite capture it.
I think it was we are on the verge of the radical radical redefinition of reality. That was the Groff's.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't know Stan Groff in great detail, but I guess what he's pointing to is both, on the one hand, the kind of crises of the modern world, which are in part a product of our mistakes about the nature of reality. You know, so for example, we take reality, certainly culturally in the West, to be materialist, and so that slices off at least half of reality, and probably the much more important half too. You know, so the one upshot of that is we're consuming material reality and asking material reality to deliver satisfaction to our souls when it can't. You know, we need more of reality in order to achieve that, in particular spiritual or divine reality. And so our crises will elicit a new perception of reality. But you know, they're real crises. There's real pain and suffering involved, so it's going to be a hard thing. And I guess that what he means is the remaking of these older perceptions, which will be inspired by older perceptions, but will be different too, because we're different ourselves now from peoples in times past. And I think in particular, it's going to require a reconciliation of the sense of being an individual and the value of that with the sense of the unity of all things. And I think also it's going to involve some kind of a new sense of things emerging from where East meets West. And so, I mean, for myself, the richest, the most appealing path that's doing this, I think, is how Advaita Vedanta, the traditions of non-dualism, which are still very much alive in Eastern philosophy, particularly Indian philosophy, how they are coming into the West, and it's now possible to access really good teachers in Advaita Vedanta. And what's happening as that comes into the West is it's revitalizing the lost, often mystical traditions, say within Christianity. And so it makes sense of people like Dante once again. And so that's the path that I'm most actively interested in right now. And both within Christianity, also Sufism. Sufism has a very rich non-dual tradition that's theistic too. Yeah, so you know, that's sort of what I'm putting my efforts and energy into, if there is going to be a change.
What? Please elaborate on non-dualism. I also feel that this is the key term, but it would be interesting to see what you mean by that. And the way I see it, perhaps it I'll give you my own framework. That Rupert has explained in his Science Set Free book that in medieval times, the reality was explained at 3 different levels: spirit, soul, and body. And the scientific revolution took the soul, so the buffer zone between matter and spirit, away. And now it's just, it seems to me that the soul is just, I mean, everybody who interests me is talking about that in one way or another. And that's, well, that's kind of my background in asking that question. How do you mean that non-duality? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so it's the realization that our being is shared, and that, you know, your being and my being, the being of all the beings around us, both human and non-human, is all as many reflections of the one being, which is the divine being. And so it's about reorientating your experience of life, your perception of life, from the sense that things are separate, things are fragmented, you know, possibly even at war, from the sense that what I need is distant, far, unobtainable, to realizing that everything that we have already is a reflection of this one being, and that is where satisfaction lies too. So that can be cultivated partly by arguments. That's another reason why I quite like the Advaita tradition, is that it respects the intellect as much as it respects consciousness in other ways, but, you know, also through meditative practices and personal reflection and so on. By turning towards particularly that which feels difficult, you see through that and realize the unity of all things. Well, so hence non-dual, you know, it's like things aren't split, aren't separate, aren't apart, actually, although they seem like that.
Perhaps a very last question. I mean, this is, again, I mean, when I started to hear Peterson, that was just so interesting for me. I mean, he really kind of, yeah, he was my kind of a way out of that mess where I was. And he really brought Jung into my, and I think that's why he struck the chord with others so much. And one sentence I remember that is that we're always in a myth, and it would be advisable to realize what myth are we in. What do you think? What myth are we in collectively now in this, you know, especially, of course, in the light of pandemic? What's the driving myth behind all this puzzling bewilderment that we are in?
Well, I think, I mean, it's certainly a cultural myth, which I mean both in terms of a story and a delusion, actually, is that we will achieve our happiness by having more. And so this drives growth, this drives the development of technology, it drives our acquisitive consumption and so on. I think that that is the big myth of our times. And so the whole of the economy is orientated around trying to sustain that growth. And personally, it's very hard not to organize your life around acquiring more and more stuff. Even if you feel that that's not going to deliver you happiness, it's very difficult to carve out any other way of life in the modern West, at least. But as William Blake put it, he said, more is the cry of a mistaken more is the cry of a mistaken soul. Nothing less than all can satisfy us. And so what he's saying there is that it's not the piecemeal acquisition of bits and bytes that will lead to our satisfaction. It's realizing that through our powers of perception and the capacity to change ourselves, we always already are part of the one, are part of the all. And so that is, I think, the myth that we need if we're going to find our way out of the mess that we're in.
What would be, given your knowledge of the Greek mythology, and you've written the book on that was more on philosophy rather than mythology, perhaps. But what would be the what Greek myth would capture that modern version of a myth that you just?
Yeah, well, I think that Plato was onto this. You see, so Plato is a myth maker as much as anything else. And so, for example, the myth of escaping from the cave is a key one, where you see the sun eventually. It goes through various stages and various struggles, but eventually the sun is seen, and it's realized that the sun's light is the source of all light and life. So that's an image and metaphor for the one that is then realized. I think that a lot of older myths are, in a way, either at a different stage in the realization of the one, or are from older perceptions of reality. We said that James Hillman is probably a polytheist. I think that's mistaken, because I think it's trying to recover an older sense of reality, rather than realizing that our individuality, our own oneness, must be the basis from which we receive and perceive reality again. And so we'll perceive it as one too. But there are other Jungian myths like the shadow, which are quite useful on the way, to realize that you might be cut off from part of yourself, and that it has qualities, like a shadow, is a really helpful myth. And so someone like Peterson is, very keen on all that. But I think you've also got to move beyond just the myths, as it were, the soul work has got to settle into the greater spirit. Otherwise, you just get involved in, there's always another neurosis to look at. There's always another trauma to try and understand. There's always, another kind of psychological stone to unturn, and it goes on ad infinitum. Really, I think the goal is to know yourself enough so you can start to see more than just yourself. And then you realize that what you took to be yourself is just the tip of the iceberg, say, of our being. And then you start to settle into that greater being. And so the stuff that happens, the suffering that happens, it may well continue, but it lessens, because you realize it's not the whole story at all. And, the spiritual traditions would tell us that suffering actually comes to an end with that. It's not to say that difficult things don't happen, but we don't react to them in the same way. And so the suffering associated with them lessens and eventually goes.
Well,